And now it's my great honor to introduce Ambassador Dennis Ross. As one fortunate to grow up in a family with a strong education about and connection to Israel, and one who believes strongly in the Federation's work to strengthen Israel, I could not have been more delighted that Ambassador Ross accepted our invitation to be with us today, especially given the proximity to yesterday's election. Having served under 4 U.S. presidents, Ambassador Ross has played an integral role in shaping U.S. Middle East policy with a specific focus on Israel. I think many of you would agree that Dennis is a riveting speaker and writer, an amazing thought leader, though his dose of reality can sometimes be incredibly sobering. We're lucky to have him here today to provide an immediate reaction on what yesterday's election means to U.S. Middle East policy. Dennis, I know you're also here because you care about the work that all of us are doing in the Federation and the Endowment Fund, and not just because you feel sorry for me that I fell down in front of you on our Aspen hike. Please welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross.
Well, it is probably true that I might not have been here had I not witnessed you take this incredible tumble down the mountains in Aspen and then pop up and say, "I'm fine." With a broken elbow, of course. Yeah, I gather something happened yesterday. One of the reasons I wanted to come was not only to be here because of today and because this is an important event, but I also knew that if I came here, I could go to the airport and I could get all the Giants paraphernalia. And, you know, having come from here, I'm a big Giants fan, and I can go around walking in Washington and wear a shirt. So I was trying to think about how I would talk about the meaning of yesterday in terms of foreign policy, and I think I need to put it in context. Typically, I have to tell you that when I used to be in different administrations, and I would have people from the press call me, and they would want some kind of scoop, and I would always say, well, let me put it in context. So I always became known as Dennis Context Ross, and so today I'm going to live up to my middle name, which is actually not Context, but I want to create a frame for you, and the way to do it is to let you know what I was saying actually in the last couple weeks when I would be asked questions. I would be asked, does it make a difference as to who the president is going to be as it relates to Middle East policy? And I said, well, obviously, it always makes a difference who the president is, but if you take a step back, one of the things you're going to see is that, in fact, the choices the president faces are actually fairly limited when you look at what he's actually confronting. And this was going to be true whether the president won or if Governor Romney had won. I mean, number one, Iran is on your plate, front and center. It's a priority. That's a given. And I'm going to talk more about what the real choices are. Number two, there is an Arab awakening that has taken place. And the term awakening I use quite consciously because it was never going to be an Arab Spring. I mean, I know that there are a lot of people who like to talk about the Arab Spring. How many people here have heard the term Arab Spring? How many people here think the term Arab Spring was appropriate? Good. Obviously, I gave the answer away by saying Arab Awakening. But the reason it was never appropriate, because Arab Spring implies this was going to be a rapid change. Not only was it going to be a rapid change, but it was going to be a rapid change in which you were going to see everything flower very quickly. It was going to come into bloom. It was going to be promising. You were going to have the spirit of spring. And the transformation was going to take the Middle East and take it to an entirely different place and turn it into this glowing region of democracy. Now, it isn't to say that there isn't change in the Middle East. There is. And it isn't to say that the change over time could yet prove to be promising. But the one thing that was clear was the change was never going to be fast. It was never going to be linear. And it was never going to produce the kind of outcome we wanted to see in a very short order. So I have to say something, and I will say something about the Arab Awakening and the choices that the president will face when it comes to that. One element of the Arab Awakening is what you see in Syria. Obviously not such a positive element of the Arab Awakening. And what we're going to see in Syria is going to be a continually worsening situation that's going to require, I think, greater involvement, and I'll explain what that is as well. And, you know, I couldn't come here and not talk about the peace issue because obviously I've devoted a major part of my adult life to trying to deal with it. And I want to put that in some perspective as well, but also, again, from the standpoint of what are the choices that the president faces. All right, so there's the context for you. There's the framing for you. Let's start with Iran. I'm tempted, Ron, having heard you talk about George Jessel, who I did remember, by the way, and George Carlin, who I remembered better. I'm tempted in the best Honey Youngman imitation I can do. Now take Iran, please. If you take a look at where we are with Iran, I will tell you something that's going to sound like you've heard it before, but it's the first time I'm saying it. And that is 2013 will be a decisive year on Iran. Now, the reason I say that is I have heard from a lot of different Israelis since 2005, this is the year. Well, you know, I can tell you actually this is going to be the year. Now, why do I say that? I say it because we have a set of sanctions that have never been imposed before on Iran. The Iranians are feeling the impact of that. This Iranian leadership is feeling the impact of that in a way they've never felt it before. And the measures of that, by the way, are what the Supreme Leader himself is saying. The Supreme Leader, a week before last, gave a speech in which he said, the sanctions are brutal. His word, the sanctions are brutal. Now, in the past, he's referred to the sanctions and he said, the sanctions don't hurt us. We've had sanctions since the Islamic Republic came into being. The sanctions make us stronger. We're more self-sufficient. We're not afraid of sanctions. And now, a week before last, he says the sanctions are brutal. And by the way, they are. You know what's happening to their currency? Every 2 months, by some estimates, their currency is being devalued by half. Now, think about what that means. What you have in the bank today is going to be worth half as much as it was, and what you're buying in terms of goods is going to cost you twice as much as it did. It's affecting everybody. You had demonstrations during Ramadan because of a lack of chicken. You couldn't get chickens because you couldn't get chicken feed. You never had that before. You had, week before last, you had demonstrations in the bazaar. Now that's, if you go back to 1979, that's actually where the demonstrations began. So you see upheaval. You see in the Supreme Leader's speeches, by the way, he's given 2 speeches in the last 2 weeks where he called on all the Iranian officials to stop fighting each other, stop criticizing each other. It's interesting, by the way, the head of the Revolutionary Guard is challenging and criticizing the head of the central bank and holding him responsible for what's happening to the currency. The head of the military is attacking the Iranian president, Ahmadinejad. The Speaker of the Parliament is doing the same thing. Interestingly enough, they're attacking each other as it relates to the economy. They're actually not blaming us for the sanctions, and you know why? By the way, whenever I pose a question, I always know the answer. It's really funny how that works, but the reason they're not attacking us is because nobody there will believe it, because they know it's the regime that is responsible. Their production of oil, their output of oil, which used to be 4.1 million barrels a day, their output of oil is down to 2.6 million barrels a day. I'm not even talking about what they're able to sell, which is about a little bit less than half of what they were selling before. They have lost the ability to gain technology and the kind of capital they need to reinvigorate their energy infrastructure. And they're down to 2.6 million barrels a day because they couldn't store the oil they couldn't sell. They ran out of all the ability to store it. And they couldn't keep pumping it. And because they couldn't keep pumping it, they had to shut fields down. And because of the dilapidated nature of their energy infrastructure, it may not be so easy for them to recoup that. So they are feeling it. And this creates a potential for them to change their behavior. So the good news, why you're saying, gee, so you're telling us why 2013 might be a decisive year, and you're implying it's because they're under a great deal of pressure. That's part of the equation. That's the good news. Now the bad news. You know, whenever I come home, when I say to my wife, I've got good news and bad news, I don't know why, she always asks for the bad news first. But I gave you the good news first. Now I'm going to give you the bad news. The bad news is that, in fact, their nuclear program keeps proceeding. So even though they're under enormous pressure, and I do believe it's concentrating their mind to the point where they are going to look for a diplomatic way out, the real reason this year is going to be a decisive year is because by the end of the year, if they don't make a change, and they could, if they don't make a decision to stop their program unilaterally, and there is no agreement by the end of this year, we will no longer be in a position to know whether we could stop them from presenting the world with a fait accompli. Meaning, they could present the world with a nuclear weapons capability before we could do something about it. The President's objective is prevention, not containment, meaning prevention of that capability, not containing it after the fact. By the way, both he and Governor Romney both said that was their objective, prevention. Now, what I'm saying to you is by the end of this year, unless the Iranian nuclear program changes, unless they stop, we won't be in a position to know whether or not we can fulfill that objective. Having worked for this president for 3 years and having spent a major part of my time on this issue, I can tell you he didn't come to the issue of prevention on an impulse. There was a debate within the administration over whether prevention versus containment should be the objective. And in the Q&A, if you want me to explain why he made this decision, I'm happy to say. The point is, he made this in a calculated way. He understands if diplomacy doesn't work, that leads you to the use of force. Now, I believe the president, or had it been Governor Romney, both of them would have, before the end of this year, before the end of 2013, in the case of the president, because this is an issue he's lived with for the last 4 years. He's thought through all the options. He knows what the choices are. I believe whoever was going to be president was going to have one more major diplomatic initiative designed to put on the table a proposal that would test the Iranians and say you want civil nuclear power. Here is an option that will give you civil nuclear power, but it will be restricted in a way that doesn't allow you to convert it into nuclear weapons. If you're prepared to accept it, we have a way out. If you're not prepared to accept it, we expose you before the world, including your own public, that you're not about wanting civil nuclear power, you're about wanting nuclear weapons. I don't believe that whoever was president was going to simply, having adopted the objective of prevention, was simply going to end up using force without some more dramatic, vivid demonstration that we had gone the extra mile to make it clear that we didn't resort to the use of force before we had exhausted every possibility. Now I come back to where I started. It is precisely because the Iranians are under such pressure that such a diplomatic initiative might actually work. I can't tell you it will, I can tell you what it will come down to. What it will come down to is, what does the Supreme Leader decide is the greatest single threat to his regime? I've often said, and maybe some people here have heard me say it because I've said it on TV, I've said it in other speeches, the most important objective for the Supreme Leader? You want to know what the most important objective of the Supreme Leader is? Please ask me. What's the most important objective of the Supreme Leader? To die in office of natural causes. Who is the greatest threat to that? We are, if there actually is use of force. The combination of the economic pressure, the likelihood that if diplomacy fails, force will be used, is, in my mind, increasing the prospect that he may seek a way out. But it's going to come down to, does he decide that an agreement with us is a threat to his regime and his power because he's built a regime based on hostility towards us? Or does he decide that not having an agreement is going to threaten the regime precisely because of the economic pressures and dislocations you're seeing today? Nobody can tell you that answer, but I think what I was trying to suggest to you is a context has been created that increases the prospects that if diplomacy was ever going to work with this Iranian regime, that context has been, in fact, created. Whether it will work remains to be seen, but I'm confident, I can't know this, but I'm confident that there will be some kind of major diplomatic initiative that will be designed to test the proposition that the Iranians only want civil nuclear power. If they're looking for a way out, they'll have that way out. So it'll be up to them to take it or not. All right. That's why 2013 will be decisive, either through diplomatic means or through non-diplomatic means. All right, I will probably exceed the time I have available to me if I go through each of the other issues the way I just did on Iran. But I was on a roll, so I couldn't stop. All right, so what about the Arab awakening? I'll do Egypt and the Arab Awakening. Look at Egypt today, and you see the Muslim Brotherhood controls all the institutions except the judiciary. And I'm sure it's only a matter of time before they try to take over the judiciary. Now, does that mean the story in Egypt is now written? It's done? No, it doesn't. This brings us back to the term awakening that I used at the beginning. What you have is an awakening in the following sense. People in this part of the world, certainly the non-monarchies, see themselves for the first time as being citizens. They think they have the right to make demands. They think they have a voice. They're not about to surrender that voice. They have a set of expectations. They want to create accountability. One of the reasons that this is never going to be a quick process and never was going to be quick, because the institutions of accountability don't exist. And it's going to take time to create those institutions. But the Muslim Brotherhood, President Morsi, when he looks out, realizes he's got a public that has a set of expectations. This is not the same Egypt as Mubarak, where he could govern, rule, as if the public didn't matter. Today in Egypt, there's something called the Morsi meter. Anybody ever heard of the Morsi meter? The Morsi meter is something that a group of bloggers have set up to see how President Morsi is doing in terms of the promises he's made. Can you imagine there would have been a Mubarak meter? I can tell you what would have happened to the guys who were doing it. There is a Morsi meter. Now, that doesn't mean that in itself says, okay, he knows he's got to produce. But what we're seeing is a kind of increasing manifestation that President Morsi understands he has to deliver. Again, because there's a sense of expectation on the part of the public. Now, we have today in Egypt two different realities. One which is unsettling, and one which creates a sense of some potential. The side of it that's unsettling is that side of the Muslim Brotherhood whose ideology counts for everything. And so when there are realities, they don't accept the realities. They deny the realities. So President Morsi sends a letter to Shimon Peres in response to Shimon Peres sending him a good wishes greeting for Ramadan. And when President Peres, after finding out, getting clearance from the Egyptians to release the fact that he got a letter from President Morsi, releases it, and there's a backlash among the Muslim Brotherhood, President Morsi denies he sent the letter. Now, what does it say when you deny a fact? What does it say about an ideology that can't acknowledge truth? Because truth is somehow seen as a threat. Not a good indication. The Muslim Brotherhood, when there was an attack in the Sinai that killed 16 Egyptian soldiers, and the people who did it were al-Qaeda types who then tried to go into Israel and the Israelis stopped them, the Muslim Brotherhood said Mossad was behind it. Obviously untrue. Now, to his credit, President Morsi didn't say Mossad was behind it, but the Muslim Brotherhood's first response was Mossad is behind it. Again, can't accept reality. 2 weeks ago, you had the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood give a sermon in which he said all Jews are corrupt, called for jihad, said the only thing the Israelis understand is force. And when there was a backlash from the outside, Muslim Brotherhood denied he said it. The only problem is he actually said it. You could see it on YouTube. Again, what does it say about those who create one reality and can't acknowledge the real reality? Not very promising. But there's this other. I said there's two different realities in Egypt today. There's this other reality. President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, when they're outside the government, weren't prepared to accept an IMF standby loan because of conditionality built into it. Today, they want that loan, even with the conditionality, and even though the loan itself they now seek is $4.8 billion and not $3.2 billion. And they're ready to accept the conditionality. About 6 weeks ago, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce brought the largest delegation of private sector companies from this country ever to Egypt. They saw President Morsi, they saw the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, and everyone they saw said, we want your investment, we want your partnership. You tell us what we need to do to create a climate so you'll come here and you'll invest here. That reflects an understanding of reality because they know they have to deliver on the economy. And if they don't deliver on the economy, clearly they are worried that they'll lose their legitimacy and they may not be able to sustain themselves in power. So what we see here are two different realities. It has an implication for us. It has an implication for the administration. It would have an implication for whoever was president. The implication is, be very clear about what our principles are. We do not have an interest in Egypt becoming a failed state. That's a fact. Who do you think would face the worst possible threat if Egypt became a failed state, aside from us? I mean, for us, we're distant. Egypt's a failed state. It's a profound threat to Israel. So we don't have an interest in Egypt being a failed state. The Israelis don't have an interest in Egypt being a failed state. On the other hand, should we provide assistance to the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly if they're going to promulgate and promote this false reality? The answer is no. But if they want to, in fact, deliver economically, if that's something that's motivating them, which it appears to be, if they want our help, then we should be prepared to provide it, provided they live up to a set of principles and what I'll also call practicalities. Now, I'm not going to list the principles in order of their most importance. I'm going to list them in terms of what's occurring to me as I speak. And I'm not going to talk about the mosquitoes in a nudist colony. No, I mean, number one, principle number one, but it's also practicality. Principle number one, respect minority rights. This is fundamental to us. We shouldn't be providing help unless they provide that, unless they respect minority rights. But for them, it's a practicality. 10% of their population are Coptic Christians. If they started leaving in large numbers, who's going to invest in Egypt? Who's going to provide help to Egypt? The answer is nobody. So it's our principle, but it's their practicality. Principle number two, don't exclude half your population. You know, they're drafting a constitution right now. Some of the language on equality looks good as it relates to women, and some of the language is potentially quite problematic. 56% of the Egyptian women are illiterate. You're going to have a successful society if, in fact, you exclude half your population? The answer is no. So our principle, their practicality. Third principle, preserve political pluralism. You claim you want a rule of law. You claim you're going to preside over democracy. I have to cut it off? Okay. I got a very subtle sign. And proving that I react very well to instruction. All right, so I'll take 2 minutes. Okay. Political pluralism is something that is critical in the end for them, but also I think in terms of attracting support from the outside. They may not want political pluralism because I think the Muslim Brotherhood would like to dominate the future in Egypt. But if they don't live up to it, they shouldn't be entitled to help from the outside. And if they don't live up to it, I think they're going to be vulnerable on the inside. The fourth principle, which is also fundamental to us and also a practicality, they have to respect their international obligations, including, first and foremost, their peace treaty with Israel. And I don't mean by nodding at their peace treaty with Israel. I don't mean by allowing the Sinai to become this safe haven for those who will threaten Israel. I don't mean by allowing Hamas, which actually will pay attention to the Egyptian leadership, to fire rockets into Israel. I mean live up to your obligations. And there's, again, not just a principle for us, but a practicality. Again, who is going to invest in Egypt if there's a confrontation with Israel? The answer is nobody. Now, I say all this because there's a built-in potential for us to have leverage and influence. Obviously, they can say no. They can make their own choices. But guess what? We can make our own choices too. So we should be prepared to help Egypt. We don't want it to be a failed state. But there should be ground rules. And the ground rules should reflect these principles. And one other little factoid for you, just to show that it can actually work. You know, the first 24 hours after our embassy was under assault because of the video in Egypt, I'm not talking about Libya, I'm talking about Egypt. President Obama, called President Morsi and he said, "You don't protect our people, you get nothing from us." The first 24 hours, they didn't do anything. Why? Because, look, they didn't want to look like the last regime. They didn't want to look like Mubarak. Many of the people on the street were the Salafis and Islamists, and was the Egyptian government now going to be stopping them as they were protesting and expressing their anger over this video? Not so easy for them to do. As soon as the president made the call, guess what happened? They protected our embassy. The lesson here is be straight. Don't try to humiliate them in public. If you say certain things in public, then you will give them a nationalist mantle on which to stand up and protect their dignity. But be very clear about what the principles are, and don't be afraid. There's certain things we certainly can say in public. But the fact is, the critical thing is to recognize they have certain needs. Our readiness to help them has to be a function of, in fact, the principles that I just described. Again, the president will face Iran. He'll have a certain set of choices. This year is going to be decisive. I think there'll be a diplomatic initiative. The Arab awakening that we see in Egypt and elsewhere, the importance of us providing help to them might exist, but it needs to be governed and shaped by the establishment of very clear communication, very clear ground rules, and a readiness to be consistent on them. All right, I got the sign to stop, so I went beyond my allotted time, but I'll stop there. I'll stop there.
You're terrific.
Thank you.
We are so fortunate to have a hometown boy like Dennis Ross leading our interest in making sure that Israel is a place of strength, that the U.S.-Israel relationship is strong, and that we have every faith that you will be involved just as much as you always have been. Thank you once again,
You're
Ambassador
welcome.
Ross.
Okay.
And now the best is still yet to come, because there are so many phenomenal philanthropic workshops for all of us to participate in. You have these little booklets. These booklets tell you what is up at 2 o'clock, and then another set at 3:20. They're on this floor and on the second floor. I hope you'll join me in participating. Thank you once again for coming to this phenomenal lunch. Congratulations once again to Ron Kaufman. Thank you again.